Yeah, okay. Thanks, Tim, and thanks everybody. It's good to see you all. A lot of familiar names, anyway, if not all faces. Um, yeah, my name's Jim McAdam. I suppose I started my interest in agroforestry. Sort of started in the mid 1980s when, well, the driver in those days, what was the lack of, first of all, from an Irish perspective, we were having big problems with intensification of grasslands and so on, and there was an interest in starting to grow trees and getting more trees because we had really the lowest tree cover in Europe at about 6%. So my boss at that time, Professor Wright, he went to a meeting in I think 1986 or 7 in Birmingham, and just as I suppose in his senior position, and he came back from that and he said, there's a group of people out there who are interested in this idea called agroforestry. I want you to take it on board and go for it. So thereafter, I joined. I represented him at it and so on. So, but we in those days we were interested in trying to get trees onto farms, and in the Northern Irish case anyway, it was onto small farms where farmers were reluctant to give up land and put land into trees because to take a hectare out of a 25-hectare farm was a substantial thing. So we looked around, a group of us looked around at models really around the world that might apply, and we looked particularly at the New Zealand model, this idea of silvopasture, where they were planting radiata pine into grassland, and on that basis, mainly for soil erosion, that was their main drive in those days. There wasn't really a consideration of carbon or other ecosystem services, but that model we thought might fit in the UK, and a group of us then set up what we call the National Network Silvopastoral Experiment. And that there were 6 sites set up across the UK where we followed a very rigorous scientific protocol across all those sites. One was in Bangor, Wales, Tim, as you know, and the others were spread out across the UK. But we followed a very strict scientific rigor on it, and for that reason, a lot of the data come out of it was really very verifiable. It was replicated on each site and replicated between sites and so on. And I go into that in a bit of depth because when we looked around at, we followed a common protocol right across that whole experiment, and it was a really successful experiment because although there was no central funding, it depended on funding from each body's core institution, and then laterally we got part of a couple of EU projects. But we wanted to follow a strict management protocol and to do exactly the same thing on each site. So we reseeded each site with grassland, and then we planted into that wide-spaced trees for sheep to graze under. And the species we chose was sycamore, because sycamore was the one species we decided would grow on every site. And the most northerly site was at Glensoch, just outside Aberdeen, and the most southerly was down in the Eiger station down in Devon. So we had a range of sites right across the British Isles, and we decided that sycamore was the one tree that grew everywhere. So because we wanted to establish everything quickly and are following exactly the same protocols, we had a problem of sourcing about, I think it was 20,000 sycamores plants to plant all at roughly the same time across these sites, and we couldn't get any nursery in the UK to supply those. So I think eventually the stock then came from Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia as it was then, and so it was Eastern European plants were put in, but also on each site we used 2 species. We then chose a species which we thought would suit our own individual site best, and we picked ash alongside the sycamore. In other words, we'd duplicate plots of ash, which was great because the ash did fantastically well, and they demonstrated that silvopasture would work. Okay, the problems have come along now, but at least with 30 years of clear growing of ash and silvopasture, which was successful. And the sycamore failed on most of the sites, and we largely blamed that on the provenance. Because I've seen examples of where sycamore did well planted in other sites. So I'm before I finish, I would just say I'm a supporter of using sycamore in agroforestry. I think it's got a great potential. But within the national network experiment, it didn't succeed, but I think that was purely because of the planting stock we got was not suitable. It was of substandard quality. But thereafter, then I managed the agroforestry program in Northern Ireland, and I just retired from that and so on. But I believe that we now have a 30-year trial still running, or over 30 years still running at Loughgall, where we've still got the replicate plots and we've still got the comparisons of trees, no trees, silvopasture and woodland. So I think it's probably one of the longest running trials in Europe still running with that replication. So I think it's an important resource to keep going from that point of view. But to come back to the sycamore at the end of the day, I mean, I'll just throw a couple of spanners in just to start people off. First thing is the native versus non-native debate. When we get people who come to see our site, we have conservation organizations and all sorts of people. Some of them are not happy with the idea of using Sycamore. I'll just say right from the start, I don't think that's a valid debate now with climate change and with the fact that our flora and fauna is going to change irreversibly, and there's not a lot we can do about it, that we shouldn't be too hung up on the type of trees that on the origin of the trees that we plant. The second thing then is the capability of using sycamore. It's a tree that will grow anywhere, and that is true. In Ireland, certainly it grows in upland sites. It's a very iconic tree. I mean, it's a part of our landscape. If you look across the Irish rural countryside, which at one stage had a huge population density and a lot of people living in small cottages or small stone cottages, round about all of those were planted sycamore trees, and you'll see those dotted over the country as, you know, just as a legacy of a previous generation almost. But they do well in many situations. I think if they're properly looked after, they can produce a very good tree. They do well in agroforestry. The foliage the litter is a bit of a problem. If you cut, sheep will certainly eat fresh leaves or leaves that are reasonably dry or that are reasonably soon cut. But whenever you have in the autumn a large amount of litter, that is, I agree, a problem. But apart from that, I think it's got great potential, widespread right across the island of Ireland, which just brings me to really where I am at the minute. I've retired from being actively involved in research, but I'm very involved in promoting agroforestry across the island of Ireland, because I believe there's a great revival in the interest in agroforestry, largely driven by a lot of the problems facing the agriculture industry, but also, you know, by people who are interested in trying to use trees and woody plants much more in more sustainable farming systems. And I'm delighted to see amongst the people who are on the list attending tonight, there are quite a few of those who are actually involved in our setting up what the Irish Agroforestry Forum, which we have now formally formed, and are just really putting the nuts and bolts into place of how we run it. So we as a group are delighted to be there, but we're also obviously will have close links with the Farm Woodland Forum, which I have been chairman of it for quite a long time in the 90s and so on. So that's my spoke on sycamore. I support it. I think it's got potential as an agroforestry tree because it's adaptability, and particularly in the light of climate change, we're going to need trees that are adaptable. So I'll throw that one in to start, Tim.
Yeah, no, that's a good start for us, and we've already got a couple of questions to follow up on, but I'm going to quickly move around. Imogen, can I pick on you next, because I can see you across the faces that are here. Are you happy to give us your 5 minutes on sycamore?
Yeah, I am. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? I've had a bit of computer trouble.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Great stuff. Okay. Hello, my name's Imogen Raybone, and I look after the Trees on the Land project over in Ireland, which is essentially a tree cover project. We work with a lot of farmers, community groups, schools, smallholders, all sorts of different landowners, and we work mostly with small areas of tree cover, so hedgerows, shelter belts, orchards, parkland, wood pasture, agroforestry a fair bit, and small woodlands, the odd bigger woodland, but mostly small odds and ends. We as a group aim to take always the broadest possible view that we can of what tree planting means. So we try to embrace all the different points of view and the different attitudes to trees, the ways you can plant them, the systems that you can use, and the benefits of them. So it's a very, very broad project. In a more personal capacity, I've worked with horses all my life, sport horses and race horses, and I've always been fascinated with wood pasture as a sort of, if you like, an ideal system for feeding equine livestock. And I'm fairly convinced about all other livestock as well. I think certainly silver pasture and wood pasture there's a lot of mileage in there for farming now and on into the future. So that's me. That's what I do. Just to set the record straight here before I go on, I'm definitely not a sycamore hater. I'm as unsure as the next person about whether you'd call it native or not, whether it's invasive or not, whether or not we're going to be very grateful to have it here in a few years' time if the climate changes significantly. So what I'm about to sort of explain is certainly not against sycamore as a blanket sort of rule. Essentially, the main problem with sycamore that I've come across a lot, and it's a relatively recent thing, I had never heard of it. We all know when working with horses that some people consider oak to be poisonous, some people consider, well, certainly yew is known to be poisonous. But sycamore I'd never heard anything about until about 2010, when there was a lot of sort of scuffle went around the equestrian industry, horses dropping dead from eating sycamore regen in paddocks. So places where a lot of stories about places where there have been sycamore trees for generations and suddenly horses getting under them and eating up. It seems to be the seeds and the seedlings that are poisonous. There's a toxin called HGA, which is, I think, hypoglycin A is the proper name for it. The syndrome is called atypical myopathy, and it attacks the muscles. Once it's ingested, it attacks the muscles and it puts horses off their legs, paralyzes their heart muscles and lung muscles and so on, and it's a pretty rapid end. It's certainly not a nice disease. So there seems to be, I don't know that there's a huge amount of research about it. I have got, if people want links to some papers about it, I do have them. Vets aren't entirely sure whether it does or doesn't affect sheep, cattle, pigs, and so on. A lot of people would claim they've had, cattle and sheep eating sycamore leaves and litter and seedlings for years. And indeed, it's a great way to control sycamore regen if you need to graze it. But there does seem to be a significant problem with horses. And so I suppose from a silver pasture point of view, it's a concern from my side where improved commercial pasture is set with, let's say, pure sycamore. Now, that's a very different situation to a more wild, informal wood pasture setting where you might have 20 species of trees, 50 species in your pasture, and all kinds of other odds and ends to be eaten. I'm talking more about concerns in intensive systems where animals have a choice of, say, a monoculture of something ryegrass, and then sycamore set equidistant across the pasture, where you leave animals to have a very narrow choice about what they should and shouldn't eat. So there's not a huge amount known about it, but it's something that every time it comes up and every time I see a new big sycamore project going in, I always think, God, I hope they won't be mowing commercial hay for horses off that, or it's an issue with silage and hay. But really hand over to the vets in time and hope that we see a little bit more research coming through perhaps a little bit more about whether it does affect cattle, sheep, pigs, and everything else. That's my 2 cents anyway. A warning.
Okay, thanks, Imogen. And we're already getting quite a few comments there in the chat. So when you've drawn breath after that, we may come back to you, as we may come back to Jim to discuss some of these things a little more. Rob, I'm not quite sure whether Ted has joined us or not.
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. I can hear you. Can you hear me, Ted?
Not really. So if you give me a little tirade, and then I might move off. Just to say, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited about what you're doing. I even spent 50 quid today on a camera, and here you can't see me. So there you go. So and thank you. But so can I just go through it a bit? I really don't like the name woodland. Why don't you add woodland or wood pasture and woodland? Nothing in woodland. There's nothing for animals to eat in woodland. So I don't know why you call yourself woodland when you're, to the bulk of you, are wood pasture. And wood pasture actually is what, if you like, the oldest agricultural system in the world. It's been well tried. You know it is. It's sustainable and it works. And what I want you to add to your logo is two-tier agriculture, because you're getting a crop from the trees and you're getting crops from the land. And you don't get that in woodland. Woodland you cut down. Woodland is forestry. You are wood pasture. And please start looking up your own where you are. So that's me on that one. And while I'm at it, we have actually made our first tree fodder hedge. So we have a hedge which is non-thorn. And the idea is, and Imogen will tell you about it, the idea is that we can cut that, and the trees that we're using will be, as Imogen we're still on the cusp of doing this, but it's going to be what I call medicine trees or medicine bushes. So please have a look at that, and I'd love to have a whole one of these phone-ins on wood pasture to boost you. Because you people are right in the forefront of wood pasture. Happy?
Ted, we're definitely do that. I guess the question very quickly then is, in our two-tier wood pasture system, to what degree do you expect to see sycamore in there?
Well, I think at the moment, with this planting paranoia, which is going on all over the country, and we're going to end up with dense, lifeless plantations, which we don't want, the wood pasture people like yourselves would be right in the forefront of pushing for two-tier agriculture. So when we come to sycamore, I'm obviously not sure, but it would be, if you were starting off into what I call toxic arable land, which is coming into out of it into sort of a more of an organic thing, then I certainly would use sycamore as to establish the soil communities. It's top tree for establishing soil communities, including sallow and some of the poplars. They really do, when the worms arrive, they really do take down the leaves and get the humus back going and all the rest of it. After that, I'm not sure. But if the trees were wide spacing, because in a wood pasture system, the trees are fruit trees. So it's like an orchard. It is an orchard because you're getting fruit from the trees, whatever they are. So they're open grown. Now, once they get over a certain height and you can lift them, then the shade, there won't be much shade. So sycamore won't be affecting your ground cover. But whilst it's a dominant shade tolerant tree, then the ground cover is not very great. So you have to manage it and lift it to get the light underneath. From the point of view of wildlife, it's one of the top trees in the country. And that applies to Europe as well. And we are the home now, I think, of when it comes to sycamore, because we have so many good trees, old trees, and that's where I came up with this idea of the Celtic maple. So I'm pushing it, but Imogen's probably the best person to talk to about what we feel. But when we had at NEP, the rewilding project, when we had some heifers or young steers, they ate some yew clippings which somebody had left on the ground, and it was and the first thing you realised was there was snow on the ground. So these cows ate yew clippings on empty stomachs. So that led me to think, what happens when these animals are, if you like, are on what I call real food, which is flower-rich pasture. It's got to be flower and herb-rich pasture. And I think I could send over to your group some pictures I took of the Prince of Wales's estate in Romania, where they've never seen a vet, the animals, and when you hold up some of the hay, it's difficult to find any grass. And then I was talking to some people at Reading who are looking at methane, for example. And when they looked at methane, what they found was, or methane from animals, what they found was that where the animals are eating herb, flower-rich meadows or pastures in the hay and in the pasture, the methane is greatly reduced. Because a lot of these plants carry chemicals which reduce the methane. So, and again, I put the wood pasture group like you right in the forefront of that. So Sycamore, incredibly good. It's in the top few trees for wildlife. It is shade tolerant. It will cause shade, but if you manage it, I think it'll be an excellent tree. To me, it'll grow anywhere. It's the furthest north tree. It's in let me think, one of the Shetland Islands. It's right up there, and it's right down in the south. And I heard an Irish laddie talking, and we have an ancient sycamore right down on the southwest coast of Ireland, which has got all the rare insects, which would be the same anywhere. So, as far as I'm concerned, it was always in Ireland. I think I've said enough. I love it
Wonderful.
If we can get together and have a meeting on wood pasture to give you people a pat on the back, because you're the cavalry. I mean, other people will follow where you're going or where you've been and your experience. Yeah. And I can't tell you what happened to me today, but there's a lot of people interested in soil recovery and wood pasture. So if we don't hear from me again tonight, thank you very much. I look forward to the wood pasture one.
Okay, perfect. We were going to ask for more topics later. Rob,
Sorry?
I better quickly move on to you. Thanks, Ted. Rob?
So that's it. Good? Yeah?
Yep, you've done well. Brilliant. Thanks, Ted.
No. I'm right behind you. And there's a lot of other people. Take it from me. I'll see you then, folks.
Thank you, Rob.
See you in the new year.
And you.
Bye.
Bye. Sorry, Rob. Can you hear us okay, Rob? I think your mic's on, so you're good to go. Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So, hello, everyone. I'm Rob Crane. I'm an ecologist. I'm an ecological consultant. And when Ben asked me to say something about Sycamore the other day, I have to admit my reaction was one of ambivalence. Not ambivalent about speaking, but just what I felt about Sycamore. I've been an ecologist for 25 years. I don't think I've ever proposed planting it. So I think probably my reaction of ambivalence might also sum up about how ecologists feel about it, because for years and years they've been trying to remove it from nature reserves, and not seeing it as something that's adding value really to what they're trying to conserve. But on the other hand, we're now seeing increasingly its biodiversity value, and also its increasing importance for locking up carbon. So I think there's probably a changing view, and that probably is why myself and a number of people are feeling sort of a split on it really. Someone mentioned earlier about it being considered whether it's a native species. Well, yeah, it's perhaps a silly debate really. It's a naturalized species. It's been around here for certainly since the Middle Ages, but because it's been here relatively short time, it doesn't have quite as many of the associated wildlife that some of our traditionally native species has. But what's a native species? If you go back far enough, then there wasn't anything here. So so I just wanted to say a bit about what we're sort of learning about the biodiversity value. I think some damage was done years ago when it was compared to other tree species, particularly oak, which is a bit of an unfair comparison because oak's a superstar in terms of the number of insects it supports. but also the context in which it was looked at was a certain situation where those trees were studied, and they didn't look at all taxa. So they hadn't looked at lichens at that point, and bird species. And actually, when you look at these other things, fungi and lichens, there's actually quite a lot of biodiversity associated with it. And then if you compare it to a less impressive tree, let's compare it to holly. It actually has more insects associated with it. It has more lichens associated with it. It's fairly similar to field maple, which is a closely related species. So, you know, I think it probably has had a bit of bad press. And what I was also going to say is, on top of that, probably the other reputation, or the other reason its reputation is being poor, is because it just grows very easily anywhere it wants. It's not a fussy tree. It will grow along railway lines. It will grow on rubbish tips. It's pollution tolerant. It will grow in cities. So actually that could be considered a good thing. But I think its success at growing in various places has enabled it to have a reputation that's hasn't been too good. Yeah, I want to say possibly its bad reputation has been slightly overblown. And Jim mentioned about the leaves, I think, earlier. Yes, it does produce a lot of leaves. They break down. I understand they break down fairly quickly, but also they do boost the earthworm population well. Yes, they do produce shade, but you can get native plants, woodland plants growing under it, woodruff, wood anemone. It comes into leaf earlier than other tree species, so it does have in a woodland setting, it has a competitive advantage, and that's why in the early stages, certainly, in the early stage when it's developing in a woodland, you tend to have less growing under it. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I think part of the problem is we haven't allowed it to grow into mature woodland very often. So a lot of the harmful effects we see with sycamore is when it invades into a new area, and you see a lot of saplings, and sure, that's going to have a change on the botanical makeup there. But actually, when it's allowed to develop into a mature wood, then we might start to see a pattern of co-dominance with other species, and it doesn't necessarily remain the dominant canopy. Under the sycamore woodland, seedlings, when it's mature, seedlings are vulnerable to fungal attack. So with that being the case, other species can then start to come in. So actually, if woodland is left for long enough, if you were to look at a time lapse of a woodland, you would see trees changing all the time. You'd see a pattern of what grows where and when changing. So it might just be the scale of time that we're looking at sycamore, which has caused part of its reputation in the past. And then finally, what I want to say is, yeah, things are changing. You know, we have to look at what's going to lock up carbon quickly. Sycamore is a fast-growing species. It might be one of the trees that we need to meet our environmental objectives. We've got the environment plan, which is just about to, well, it's meant to be coming out. Obviously, it's been delayed with various other things going on in Parliament. But it is its final reading, I think, in the UK. And then in that, there are going to be these environmental objectives, and they are pretty tall orders. We've got to meet them somehow, and sycamore might be one of the things we're going to need. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Excellent. So thanks to all of our fire starters there for getting us going. And there's been quite a lot of interesting chat, including Isabel's recent question there to us all, thinking about the leaflet load. I might start by just coming back to the beginning, because there was quite an interesting discussion which sort of started off the back of Jim's first talk, and Kevin certainly seems to have a little bit of information, Kevin, about the nutritional content of sycamore. Do you want to unmute yourself for a second and give us a little bit more information? Kevin, you're unmuted, but I'm not sure we can hear you.
Yeah, if I could add maybe something on that, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just quickly, Kevin, you look like you're trying to speak. Are you unable to do so?
It's not working.
No, it is now. I can hear you. Yeah, you were working.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can. Yes, we can.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, great. What I've got is a body of about almost 15 years work now that was undertaken in zoos, looking at the nutritional content of pretty well all the hardy trees you can grow within our collections, from Scotland all the way through to Devon. That has a breakdown of the nutritional analysis throughout the year, in terms of, just to give you an idea of the sort of figures that we've got. It does dry matter, ash, crude protein, crude fiber. So if I told you that at different times of the year, if we go through from June to October, we go from 15% crude protein to 17% crude protein. We go from 9% crude fiber to 13% crude fiber. We go from 26% NDF to 30% NDF. So we've got the whole range, looking at it not just at one time, but also at it through different collections at different places, and looking at the nutritional analysis. We were using that with our vets. But if you think about something like the equids definitely toxic with the seeds. It seems to be a seed seems to be the amount is important, not just that they eat some seeds, it's the amount of seeds that they eat, and it's also the freshness of those seeds. So there's something that breaks down. But again, anybody who wants to email me, I'll send you just one of the samples from the Zoo Plant Wiki, which you can also all join, and for free you can see the analysis and information for yourselves. It's there, it's freely available, and it's a data set that I've been wanting to share for a number of years. I used to work with Paul Burgess, where we were trying to set up a 100-acre farm up at Whipsnade, where we would have been trialing all of this, but subsequently it didn't happen. I moved on, but this database has still kept being populated, so I'm really pleased about that, and great that I can share it today.
Yep, Kevin, that's wonderful news, and I'm sure we will all want to see that data. I'm certainly interested in seeing it. Jim, sorry, you wanted to come back and maybe to feed off what Kevin was saying.
Yeah, I was just saying, in terms of the fodder value, we never, although I said the Sycamore had, heavy, because we did in the early years of our trial, whenever we still had Sycamore compared with ash in the agroforestry, we never had any problems with the leaf litter. Was eventually vanished. I mean, although it was heavier than ash and it wasn't eaten as readily, it did vanish. And I had a student who was looking at earthworms and comparing earthworm numbers in tree pasture with ash and with sycamore, and with no tree pasture with just grassland, and the earthworm numbers were significantly higher in the two agroforestry scenarios than the grassland, and the sycamore was no less than the ash. I mean, there were very high earthworm numbers in the sycamore plots in those early years. So, I don't think it's a huge issue. I think it's a good, and as Kevin was saying, if you look at the data from, I think the Dutch have looked at an analysis through the year of the tree nutrient values, and the sycamore's up there, with the other trees. Sorry, Tim.
Jim, did you see Isabel's question about the 3-year-old silver arable, including sycamore? Should I start worrying about that?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. To be honest, I wouldn't worry at all. I think the leaf litter isn't a long-term issue. Certainly in the silver arable, where you're not going to have, your trees are going to be in rows, you're not going to have a big density of trees across the whole site.
Can I just interrupt a minute there, Tim?
Yeah, Bill, I was coming to you right away afterwards.
Just
far away.
I think there's likely to be a difference between the silver arable and the silver pastoral, because obviously when you've got livestock underneath the trees, then they'll be affecting the breakdown. And cattle going round in the autumn eating fallen leaves, sycamore and ash particularly. And so that will obviously hasten the breakdown. But even if that doesn't happen, the fact that they're scuffing through them, treading them in, it all hastens the decomposition rate in a way that you might not expect in a purely arable system.
And Bill, just to carry on from that, you're saying that your cows are quite keen on browsing mature sycamore.
They love sycamore and ash, and there's half a dozen species which they make a point of going for on a regular basis, and that's a I think that picks up from what Ted was saying about the importance of browse over and above what they get from pasture. So yes, and Kevin's offer of sending some data about the nutritional content, I think between us we should go for that and see if we can make something of it.
No, I mean, that's exactly what we're hoping to get out of these evenings, is just to have this sort of exchange. And if you've done nothing else but put Isabel's mind to rest about the leaf litter, I think we've done a good job. So I guess Sally has posted up a question. She's interested in the suitability of sycamore. Sally, do you want to come in there and tell us a bit more?
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in whether sycamore is a tree for shelter. So is there a lot of fruit on my line? Yeah, whether it be suitable for...
Sally, hang on, sorry. There's someone, I don't know if it's still Ted on the phone. I can't mute the phone. It's not showing on my screen. So if it is still Ted, if he could possibly mute himself, or whoever's on the phone possibly mute themselves, that would be great.
I've plugged my headphones back in now. I'm interested in what could be used as a shelter plant for coastal locations. So whether it's tolerant to sort of windy, salty places, and whether we could composite to give a dense shelter provision in that situation. If anyone's got any view on that, would be really helpful before we go and plant some.
So just to clarify, has anybody used, we've talked about the fodder value. We haven't talked about the shelter value. Again, I presume we're largely talking about pastoral systems, but we could be talking about arable systems as well. Does anybody have any views on? Go on, Sally.
Sort of, it seems potentially quite good because it's fast growing and it's quite tolerant as well. So is it something that you could plant a sort of hedge of and it would grow quite fast and be tolerant to the sort of salt and wind and then be coppiced? Well, there's lots of questions coming in now. But yeah, has anyone got any experience or advice about that? That'll be useful.
Yeah, so Sally, it is meant to be salt tolerant and wind tolerant, and that's part of the reason it's done quite well in so many places. It's just very broad in what it can withstand. So the only thing is, as a hedge plant, you wouldn't be able to, I don't think you can lay it as a hedge species. So I'm not sure how thick a screen it would produce, but it's used as a shelter, no doubt. It's planted as a shelter belt, but as a hedge plant, I'm not sure.
I guess with coppicing,
Imogen.
Is she?
Yeah, I was going to say Imogen seems to have fairly strong views on its shelter value.
Well,
you still with us, Imogen?
I don't know if you can hear me or not. I'm back. I'm calling in on the phone now. So my sound, and I think that was the end of my computer there. Yeah, it's a really mega useful plant that you can put it in as tight as a hedgerow and have it just coppice like a crazy hedgehog and chop it down. It comes back 10 times. It's outrageous. You try it.
Okay, Ian, do you want to add to that? I saw your comment there about the Sycamore site you've been working with. You're a bit quiet, Ian. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, it's not a coastal site, and the objective of doing the coppicing was to bring a poorly performing site into some form of production. So the site was coppiced when the trees were 17 years old, and there was 2 treatments put in. It was either taking out the 2 middle lines out of 4 or 3 lines out of 4, and allowing the standing trees that weren't felled to shelter the coppice and to train the coppice regrowth. And they coppiced extremely well. And it's now been singled, it's been pruned, and I've put a link up with where there's some of the more recent photos of the site, and it's looking quite impressive. But that's more for kind of timber production rather than for shelter. But a paper that I published a few years ago does have some data in there that relates kind of the amount of light that's coming through the different treatments. So it's there, and if anybody wants any more information, feel free to contact me.
Okay, I mean, it's one thing which hasn't really come up this evening is thinking about, you know, if we had this conversation, I certainly, reading about the silver pastoral trial that Jim mentioned at the beginning, one of the issues around thinking about the value of sycamore was the fact that it was, you know, it tended to not necessarily produce good timber. Certainly that was the perception at the time, because there was a tendency for the apical buds to go, and so it tended to have a greater likelihood of poor form. We have got some comments here about excellent firewood and potential for veneer if well pruned. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on the productive value of sycamore, whether that's something that we should be thinking about more in the future. Ross, is that you wanting to say something?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we
can.
can.
You hear me? Yeah, great.
Yes.
I'm a farmer and woodsman. I look upon sycamore as the new ash, rightly or wrongly. I love it. It's easy to cut, safe to work with. The grain is predictable. And, you know, if I go into a coppice or a hedge of sycamore, I'm a happy bunny. Sally, I did see a big sycamore wood opposite Dounreay on the north coast of Scotland, and it was growing very successfully about 2 miles from the coast. And the only thing was it had shelter belts of Sitka, but the sycamore was growing well. And just one final thing, I notice, well, my own experience anyway, is that the squirrel damage is much less in hedges than in woodland. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Ross. So we have competitive advantage for agroforestry over woodland systems. One of the nice things about this evening is the spread of participants, and I noticed that we have got someone from Skye. Phil, maybe you just want to come in and quickly tell us about what's happening with your direct experience, if you're happy to.
Yes, I am. So I've got a baby on my lap, so if I get any rude interjections, I do apologise in advance. All the mature trees within our township are sycamores. Some of them are well over 100 years old, and you can't tell that they are 100 years old in terms of they're blasted by salt and wind, because every other tree in the township is almost at a 45-degree angle, yet sycamore stands in a very good form and can take all of that. I don't have any aged sycamore on our own croft. We've only got 15-year-old trees, so that's something we can't add our experience on, but I think it will be a very good sacrificial species. I'll have to give it a go now, I'm sorry.
Okay, fine, thanks. I'm glad everybody's joining in. Ian, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so I was at Whitney Sawmills. They're down in South Wales, so last year or year before last, and they were saying that they think that sycamore is going to be the hardwood species of the future. That it's got great properties, great growth rates, and it's certainly one that we should be considering and looking out for.
Okay, I mean, so there's a lot to be said for sycamore from this evening. I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes left, so if you've been bursting to say something and feeling a little bit introverted, now's a good moment. I'm pleased that the squirrels raised their head very briefly. I mean, that's obviously Sycamore's reputation is certainly as good squirrel food, and it's interesting to hear that the predation is potentially lower in farm woodlands. I'm now scared to use the term farm woodlands in case Ted berates me again. In farm pasture, but does anybody else want to say anything else about potential risks that we haven't touched on this evening? If we're thinking about the timber for the future, let's try and do that in a balanced way. We're aware of the risk to horses. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add?
I was going to say,
Jerry. Yep, sorry, Charles.
I was going to say originally, of course, sycamore was used for kitchens, and things like draining boards and things like that, because it's got the right sort of consistency for it. Of course, nobody uses that anymore because they all use plastics or derivatives. And I just wonder, I take the firewood bit and maybe into biomass and that sort of thing, but I can't really see what else you would use it for. That was my first point. The other thing I was going to say was in connection with whether it's actually indigenous or not. I always thought the idea of indigenous was that the tree was here before the English Channel. And that was actually the definition of what an indigenous tree is. And that effectively there are only really 20 trees that fall into that category. And I'm afraid sycamore doesn't. But I just put that as a point because people keep talking about whether it's indigenous. And I think that if you have a concept or rule like that, which says, if it was here before the English Channel, then it is indigenous. I mean, obviously oak, Scots pine, holly, hawthorn, sloe, that kind of thing, they were all here before. But I think you'll find the sycamore could have come here with the Romans or somebody like that, but it didn't come here before the English Channel. But my original question is, what do you use the timber for when things like draining boards and cheese boards and those sort of things are no longer made? What do you use it for?
Well, I'm thanks. That's a great question, and I may have to defer back to someone like Ian or Ross if you want to come back in on that one. I don't want to get too caught up in the indigenous or non-indigenous debate. If we decided it's an outsider and it's got to go, we've still got quite a job on our hands. So we'll have to think about that a little bit. Does anybody want to come back on its potential future value for Ross? I can raise hand. Fire away.
With me. Sorry about that.
Yep.
Just to say that is so true of so many of our trees. I had a lot of beech. It was beautiful straight beech, wonderful stuff. And it had all originally been grown for the furniture industry. And by the time the beech was ready, the industry had gone. And I think it is a good point. I think so many of our hardwood trees have lost their function. And it'll be great if we could bring some of it back again. But sycamore, it is a bit of a problem. But even if it fulfilled the role of biomass alone, that would be a great function.
Okay. Bill, you look like you want to come in.
Yes, please. Thanks.
Yeah.
Just to say that it's all about timing, and one of the big calls from the Climate Change Committee is that the trees that we start growing to lock up carbon don't get used for firewood, but they get used for structural purposes to keep the carbon in circulation rather than putting it in the atmosphere. And so now is a good time to start looking back to see what these different trees were used for in the past, because where we're using artificial plastic products for kitchen, for domestic use, I'm sure we'll be able to find a lot of timber substitutes for those that we're going to need to achieve these long-term goals for using the carbon and not letting it get into the atmosphere.
Clive, was that you going to come in there? I'm just noticing that the microphone was hovering on and off. It's all right. I'm not going to force anybody to speak.
I think Clive is maybe just
John?
able to join. Tim.
Yeah. John, did you want to say something very quick? Sorry, Jim, did you want to say something? Okay, I'm sorry, I've done very bad chairing there. I've started Jim and John at the same time. John, since we haven't heard from you, maybe if you start us off and then Jim.
Okay, yeah, it was just to say that I think Future Tree Trust have been looking at Sycamore in terms of identifying and developing improved stock. So just by conventional breeding. So I think they've got, you know, if you have an objective of timber production, then, you know, it's a good idea to use good stock that's going to give you a better chance of getting something useful. So I think they've been looking at it for a number of years now, and I'll try and dig some information out and send it round across the forum.
Lovely, perfect.
Yeah, if
Sorry,
I could,
Jim.
that's a good, what I was going to say first, I think Clive has just joined, that was the only reason. But yes, in Loughgall at the research station, in AFB's research station, they have established, I think it's probably the only sycamore seed orchard in Ireland anyway, where they have planted a whole range of clones of sycamore based on form, and that will hopefully be a seed. Those will all cross, and hopefully you'll be able to get better form of trees for them. But that is on that research station in County Armagh. There is a sycamore seed orchard, really looking to the future of trying to produce better quality of sycamore.
Thanks. Is that somebody trying to say something? Is that Clive? Is that you? I've noticed that Nick and Jerry, you've been putting up lots of useful information as usual. Do you want to have a quick say on Sycamore, Jerry? And Nick, I may come to you as our final comment because it's quite a nice one. We're getting close to time.
Yes, well, I'm of course speaking from Spain now, so we haven't got a great deal of sycamore around here, but it does grow at a small extent in the north of Spain. So I think my question was more about the timber quality, because like oak, sycamore, I think, is diffuse porous, isn't it? And the timber experts tell me that if you grow diffuse porous species at wide spacing and therefore quickly, then the strength of the timber is actually potentially improved. It doesn't suffer the same problems of ring porous species. So I think that probably if we can interest some of the I don't know whether Princess Risborough still does any of the strength tests or whatever, but it would be very interesting to compare some good quality logs produced from open-grown sycamore with a conventional closed plantation grown, and just have a look at the various strength properties. I don't know who's got any funding to, or who's got any sycamore to do that comparison, but that would be really useful.
Always good, Jerry, to have further ideas for further research. That keeps us in business. So Nick, I guess your comment is related to that, really. Nick and Ian were having a pretty good discussion on the forum, the discussion forums before we started this evening. Probably a future topic for an evening like this. But Nick, did you want to say anything before we finish?
Sorry, if I'm the Nick, no, it was a question. I'm afraid I don't have any answers, but it's certainly identified by the Forestry Commission and the CCC that we need construction timber to lock up carbon, and of course to avoid the associated emissions of cement, steel, or whatever manufacture. But so I think the suggestions that have just been made in terms of proper assessment of timber qualities really need to be followed up.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So Ben, how are we doing? We're close to time. It goes very quickly when it's like this.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Time is up. I think the final question from Joe is quite a good one there. I don't know if you saw that one.
Okay. Okay, well that's a good question. So we are coming to a close. So I'll try and finish things off and give us a little bit of structure for going forward. So thanks very much for coming this evening. This was an experiment, both with the technology and with the format. I personally have got a lot out of it, so I hope that you similarly have managed to get through the technological issues and learn something from this. Joe's question is, in case you haven't seen the chat, is when's the next get together and which tree will we be focusing on next? We've been having, as I said at the beginning of this, these talks were in part driven by the activity that was happening on the Farm Woodland Forum Jiskmail, so our discussion group. And if you're not a member of that group, it's free to join, and we'd certainly encourage you to come along and continue the discussion, particularly if you were feeling a little bit shy this evening and didn't want to say anything. We'd certainly like to hear from you. And of course, we've had some wonderful offers this evening to share information, so it'd be great if we could get that onto the forums and have a look at that, so that'd be wonderful. We did have earlier today or yesterday, there was a rather wonderful discussion looking at whether we should consider the composition of our hedgerows in the future, and whether we should shift away from thinking about our traditional hedgerows and move into new species. And in the background, we thought that was quite a nice thing for discussion. But I guess what I really want to say at this point is this is going to work if we all have nice things to talk about. So I would certainly very much welcome anybody who has suggestions for things that we could talk about, or things that we'd like us to provide a little bit of detail. I quite like the no slides format, and I know Joe liked the no slides format. I think that that's a change, and it hopefully encourages everybody to join in a little bit more. We kind of like that. So that's really all I'm going to say for now. I did give myself a little PowerPoint slide because I'm always rubbish at endings. Oh yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us this evening, and thanks for feeding in as you have done. I've learnt things, and I thought I knew quite a bit already, so that's really useful. And like I said, in terms of when we do the next one, I suspect it's a Christmas period now. If we're all bored in January, and if I ask the Soil Association very nicely, hopefully they may give us an opportunity to do some more. Hopefully we don't get too successful, because I don't know how we'd cope with much greater numbers than this. This is actually quite a nice number for having a chat and allowing people to speak. And it'd be quite good if we could capture the chat, Ben. I don't know if that's possible, but there's lots of links to lots of nice photographs that I haven't had an opportunity to have a look at yet, because I'm worried too much about.
I think it saves it. So what we could probably do is copy them into a post for Jiskmail. I would say that'd probably be the best thing, wouldn't it?
Whoa.
Great. Okay, guys. The other thing, I guess, just to check on, this is 7 to 8 o'clock. We were guessing whether this would work or not. If you have strong feelings about the timings, let us know, and we'll see what we can do. But we kind of think this is reasonably good. There's never a perfect time, but this possibly works. I'm not quite sure whether the internet traffic increases at this time, which may be the only disadvantage. I haven't heard from anybody who's worried about the recording. If you are worried about the recording and don't want anything you've said to go on permanent record anywhere, please let us know. We won't do anything with it in the immediate short term, but I suspect we'd like to be able to show people what happened with this discussion to try and encourage more people to come along to the next one. And can I just say a very special thank you to our 4 fire starters who did a great job to get us going. And I better just thank Astrid from the Soil Association, who really helped us in the background to get this all set up and sort the invitations out. So grateful to everybody for your time. Thank you.